Hey, Roger. All right, we are back recording. Tiffany, can you hear us? Can you see us? Hello, Tiffany.
Looks like her mic is muted.
Yep. I cannot unmute, right?
You should be able to unmute
Now she's unmuted.
as the host.
Hello.
Hi, Tiffany.
I'm not showing that I'm connected.
Well, we hear you, so, and we see that you're logged on.
We're talking about somebody else.
I'm not sure who it shows as. Let me go get Zach.
Okay.
So who's there with Tiffany? Tiffany, are you the applicator in the training? Hi, Tiffany. There you go.
We're just using Tiffany's account on Zoom today.
This is Mr. Dale Hutcheson here.
Okay. Zach, while you're
Let me
there,
check my internet. Wait.
didn't Mr. House make it this morning? Hey, there he is.
Yes, he's
Hello,
here.
Mr. House.
All right.
Zach,
Good.
before you leave, make sure I'm going to explain participants need to sign in as well as
Okay.
sign out. So if you would show Mr. House the chat box function,
Okay.
and he needs to sign in by placing his name and pesticide license number in the chat box.
Okay. Okay. All right, Mr. Bush. Right here. So now you have all this. This will turn your microphone off so you don't hear any kind of small sounds. Video. You may have to click here to get it. What he's talking about signing in the top is under and then just type your name.
Okay. Well, what did I do?
Oh, here we go. There we go. Now try.
Oh.
Oh, that's the shift button.
I'm
I
hitting
just realized what you
control.
were hitting. There we go. And then
Just space
space it, and
over
then you can
and
type
then
your number.
374.
I'm used to the.
I know, me too. And then you
Okay.
just hit enter.
There it goes.
All right.
And then this right here and hit close. Because if you hit the X, it's going to take you all the way out.
Okay.
I think we got him going now, Wade.
All right. Well, thank y'all for helping Mr. House out and getting him into our training.
Right.
Thanks.
Wade.
All
Thank
right,
you, guys.
We're I'm going to wait a couple of more minutes. I was expecting a few other folks, so give him just a couple of more minutes to be seen, and if they're not, we'll move right ahead.
They may be running late like I was.
Yes, sir. Oh, I have someone coming now. Comes Joe. Hello, Joe. Is that you out there?
Wade, can you hear me now?
Yes, sir. Joe, how are you?
I'm just fine and dandy. Thank you for asking.
Well, glad to have you this morning. Going to wait another minute or two before we start properly.
Okay.
For last participants to join us if they are. Joe, if you could go ahead and type your name and pesticide applicator number into the chat box.
Okay.
That serves as your sign in, and you'll be asked to sign out when you leave. So I'm going to give about another 60 seconds before I start.
Where is the chat box?
If you'll move your mouse, you'll
Yes.
see a banner pop up at the bottom of the video screen where it shows the
Chat.
microphone, the video.
Okay, I see it.
Start your video for us if you will, and then there's a chat box.
Okay.
Great. And then just name an applicator number into the chat box.
Chat box. That one? Oh, yeah, I got it. Got it. 3, 7, 3, 4, 4. How many do you have at this class?
Expected 3 applicators to join us this morning. There'll be more joining this afternoon. Want to thank my colleagues, Roger Gates and Brenda Jackson and Paul Pugliese for joining in. This morning's effort, whether there were applicators join us or not, the 4 of us were going to record this training. So we have this as a tool for future use.
Okay.
But this morning we are here for Northwest Georgia Pesticide Applicator Training, an opportunity for private applicators to earn 1 or 2 hours of credit. If you attend the entire session, you'll receive 2 hours credit. You're doing that by signing in, as you two have already done, with name and applicator number, And when you leave, if it's at the end of the entire session, you will sign out simply by typing your name into the chat box, showing that you were present the entire time. And if by chance you only need an hour's credit and only wish to join us for an hour, then after the first two presentations, you could sign out and you'll get that hour's credit. But be
Okay.
sure you need to see at least 2 sessions to get an hour's credit, all 4 sessions for the 2 hours credit. If my colleagues will monitor for anybody else coming in and admit them, because I'm sure once I start talking, I'm not going to notice that. So with that, if everybody is comfortable and there are no questions, I'm going to mute everyone. And share my screen, and I'll get started with my portion. All right, gentlemen, and my colleagues, thanks for joining in. If I didn't introduce myself, I am Wade Hutcheson.
I
Yes.
need to interrupt you. So it says I can't record without requesting permission from the meeting host.
Okay, well, I did resume recording, and that means I'll have to send you the file. Is that correct?
Okay. More than likely, yep.
All right, sorry about that. If all this technology comes across, I will be very impressed with some abilities I've learned this morning. So we are going to utilize this Zoom technology for some online learning, and I meant to say earlier, I hope that everyone is safe. I am over in the Walker County office, and I'm going to share. I've got 5 topics, but just a few slides on each topic. So we will jump right into that. And I hope most of what I'm discussing with you this morning is simply a reminder. But as pesticide applicators and holders of that license, as farmers, growers, producers, we occasionally use pesticides as a tool. Pesticides are those products that are designed to help us prevent, destroy, repel, or simply reduce the number of pests. So we use them as tools in the production of our crops. Legally, pesticides also include other type products, such as plant growth regulators, defoliants, desiccants, repellents, and the list goes on for that. A pest is an organism, a living organism that's somewhere we don't want it. A weed is often referred to a plant that's out of place. Insects on crops where we don't want them. Not only do pesticides include insects and weeds, but also bacteria, fungi, nuisance animals. And then, of course, we talked about the insects and plants, such as the crabgrass or the chinch bugs and other insects that we occasionally deal with. We find out all the information about the product that we're using, how we can use it, everything we need to know about that product from the label. So it's my encouragement to you is to read that label first to understand how the product we're about to use could adversely affect other organisms. That pesticide label is our guide to safely and effectively using that pesticide product. Keep that label handy. Either start a record book with paper copies. Ensure that the label on your container remains intact. Start a database within your computer because these labels contain all the information to ensure that proper application. You know, we don't want to make applications twice. We want to make applications to the targeted pest with a product that is labeled for that pest at a rate that is described by that label, all because that information is found on that label. That ultimately is going to save you time, money, and resources. Oh, we got to admit somebody. To our newest attendee, if you would type your name and pesticide applicator number into that chat box, please. That label matters because it is the legal document that allows for that use. It is established by the FIFRA legislation, which provides the basis for that product's regulation, sale, distribution, and use. The EPA is authorized to enforce the legalities of it, to set those residue levels and tolerances for these products that we use on our foods and animal feeds. So it is established by legislation. And the bottom line with all this is that product is the law. Oh, I don't mind. The bottom line is that label is the law for the use of that product, and deviation away from that labeled intent is therefore against the law. So keep those labels intact and refer to them often. Read that label first, even before we purchase the product. As we're making our selections, refer to that label to make sure I am choosing the right product. Your county extension agent can help you in selecting those products. Certainly, as we go through other pesticide uses, such as mixing or applying, that label will give us those guidelines, those instructions on how to properly do so. That label contains the safety information to keep the applicator safe. It contains the information we're going to need for proper storage, and also lets you know disposal. There are 7 different sections to that pesticide label. Even if it's a product that you routinely use, I encourage you to read that label each and every time you're going to use that product. When you change that inventory out, get a new batch of brand X, make sure that you are familiar and you have read that label. The label can be quite complicated. The label on the container will have text or images printed right to it and be attached to the product. If you're like me, you might as well go ahead and reach for the glasses because it's in small print. and you want to be able to see it. But the label that's on the product may refer to additional documentations that may be needed as well. So any labeling, which includes the label, along with any additional printed information that label refers you to. You may often have to find that labeling information. That label information will contain statements that are mandatory as well as advisory. Those mandatory statements are there because they intend to be enforceable. It has action words in it, such as must or shall, such as the example that I've given you down here. All mixers, loaders, applicators, flaggers, and other handlers must wear. So when those action words that are there to ensure proper use are present, that doesn't leave you an out for avoiding that. If it uses those action words such as must or shall, those are mandatory statements, and the applicator is required by law to adhere to that. It might be an advisory statement that's just tended to be informational, such as latex gloves provide the best protection. I don't remember which product I pulled that statement off of, but these statements have all came off of labels that I have read. This first one here is in the precautionary statements for a 2,4-D product. So without reading that label, then we're going to miss this. Take the time to read that label, review with yourself and whomever's going to use that product under your direction, if you're not the applicator, that they're aware of those cautions and concerns to keep themselves safe, to keep the pesticide where you want it, and not causing any problems. Another part of that label I want to point out, and the reason behind you having a private applicator's license, is so that you can purchase and use restricted use products. And with all RUPs, if that toxicity exceeds a certain level, it is required as that restricted use pesticide. That RUP statement must be on that front panel. It's usually at the top of the product label, and that label includes some statements about why it is restricted use. This one is Tordon, and it is restricted use because of non-target plant susceptibility. There are other statements in that box as well. These RUPs cannot be purchased by the general public. They are available for purchase by those who maintain a private or a commercial pesticide applicator's license. Those are the ones you're recording the records for. We'll get to that in a minute. Labels don't always stay on the containers. I'm aware of that. Department of Ag's aware of that. Couple of places for you to find labels will be cdms.net and Green Book. There are others, but these are the two that I use routinely. Probably go to cdms.net a little more than Green Book, but a couple of good databases online where you can get labels for just about any product. If you're good with just a search engine, typically you can find your product label just by a search engine, but these databases are out there. So be aware of those and use as needed. I like to find my labels, and with the products that I'm using, start my own file with that product label. And then when a new inventory comes in, ensuring that the label is the same or replace that label. So find those labels as needed. Second topic I want to talk about is storing these products, and I got to pick up my pace. But we do want to create safe storage sites for our pesticides. To keep our pesticides where we want them, keep them from walking away is one reason, but also to keep unauthorized people out of our cabinet. Research shows that 50% of households have pesticides stored within the easy reach of children. So children around our operations, at home, visitors do not need to have access. So get a storage container or some type of a storage site that keeps those people out. Keep it under lock if at all possible. That storage site should also prevent unnecessary water damage. No water damage is necessary, but prevent water damage. Provide some control to the temperature to keep that product from freezing or becoming overheated during the summer, where some of its efficacy could be lost. Consider the lighting that is required. Make sure that you can see what you're going into. Non-porous materials could be used. Steel cabinets are not going to soak up that material, but your storage site, consider a non-porous material for that base. Your site should prevent runoff or at least contain the product. Within a cabinet like this, an idea might be to place these liquid containers into some type of a tote or another container, so that any leak or spill is contained by that secondary system. Source of clean water close to your storage site in case of spills or accidents where cleanup would be necessary is also recommended. Storage is hopefully not, you're not storing a lot of pesticide product. Your inventory is small, and spills are certainly a concern, but fire may be a bigger concern. So certainly especially with detached storage, separate those pesticides from any fuels. And if you've got a separate storage facility, having a separate entrance with that is a good idea, allowing for a quick exit as well as an opportunity to increase ventilation and air movement as that would be needed. So separate storage. Some general guidelines for pesticide storage. If you are storing a large amount, I encourage you to consider a building that is designed specifically for that purpose. If it's a small amount of pesticides, a separate room or a cabinet, metal cabinet, an old school locker, I've seen them used quite a bit, may be just enough for you to get that product under safe storage and lock and key. Mentioned earlier, the separate room, ensure that you've got a door that opens straight to the outside. Areas to avoid would include those areas that are prone to flooding, as well as, don't put them in a basement, especially certainly in your home as well, but avoid those areas prone to flooding. We need these products, but I encourage you when you're purchasing your product to get what you need for the job or the task or the season at hand, and take steps to reduce the amount of stored inventory that you have on hand. What's good to have? I think we've already covered, and you'll see in blue here that if you're a commercial applicator, these first three are required to be under lock, to have proper signage, to have adequate ventilation. Some other strong components to your storage system would be some type of secondary containment or a drainage. If it's a separate storage building, it's entirely possible for you to install a floor drainage that leads to a containment system. Adequate lighting, along with explosion-proof lighting, certainly based on the products that you're storing. A separate building. One that I think is important for folks to, that folks don't really think about, is a complete inventory of the product you have stored, along with their label and their safety data sheet. Maybe even keeping all that in a notebook that can be shared with any emergency response personnel that gets to show up to the emergency there at your farm or operation. A mailbox out in front of the storage unit would be a good place to store it. You could even take that and share it with your local fire department or fire chief. We've mentioned the non-porous or non-absorbent shelves or flooring. Shelves with a lip can help control small liquid spills in that storage. Move dry products to the top and those liquid formulations underneath, so that the liquids begin to leak. You're not ruining your dry products. Along with your storage system, a spill kit should also be handy. And remember, with dealing with the spill, you want to control the spill first. Stop the source of the spill, control it, contain that spill, keep it out of areas, stop the flow away from areas that you don't want that to go, especially a stream or pond or storm drain. And then after you've controlled and contained, you're ready for the cleanup process. So keep those spill kit requirements around. Couple of photos of some storage areas. There's somebody's pesticide closet. That is acceptable according to the law, and that works. I am pleased to see that they do have their pesticide storage area marked by signage. A little bit more in depth, and certainly from a commercial point of view, but some things to point out here. Remind you, dried products stored above liquids, non-porous shelving. There is drainage in this in this storage facility. So secondary containment, adequate lighting, and there is ventilation in that room as well. I will provide each one with a copy of this pesticide storage checklist, as well as a copy of of my slides will come to you via email later. And you can refer to this checklist and make your decisions and changes and improvements as needed. A couple of minutes on PPE as I try to pick up my pace. But you refer to that label to understand what types of personal protection equipment is required. And with PPE on your mind, I hope that one of the silver linings out of the pandemic is that pesticide applicators pay more attention to PPE and wearing their PPE, but refer to your pesticide label for those PPE requirements. It can vary with the product. Any of these things, these are more examples of what I have found off of labels, can be anything from coveralls or long sleeves, long pants, shoes plus socks. Typically, if you're mixing or handling, you want to wear chemical resistant gloves, because when you are mixing and handling, your hands and forearms are at greatest risk of exposure to those pesticide products. But it could also include the eyewear, headgear for any overhead exposures, chemical resistant aprons. Refer to that label for what is required for you to mix, load, handle, and apply that product. Now we're ready for the application, so let's make that application safely. Most of our farmers are using some type of a sprayer or spreader. Calibration is very important to understanding that you are putting out the right amount of product. So take the time to calibrate that sprayer. Avoid those non-target areas, surfaces, and organisms. Understand and apply where your product is intended to go, and put that product on the site where it's supposed to go. Think about the weather before that application. Check it and re-verify it to make sure it's right and gonna be right post-application for you to make that timely application. Establish buffers around that targeted area and maintain those buffers around those sensitive non-target areas. And always operate that equipment safely and effectively. There's some applicators I've seen out there think they're driving low-flying aircraft, and at high speeds that equipment likely is not giving you an effective application. That ground speed is part of your calibration process, so operate that within the parameters you set up when you calibrate your sprayer. Calibration means you understand the output based on the area that you're treating, whether it's per square foot or 1,000 square foot or on an acre basis. Calibration also includes that we're going to mix, measure and mix our concentrates and products accurately and safely. When we're making that application, pay attention to your equipment. That delivery rate can be changed by clogged nozzles, corroded nozzles. Those should have been found during the calibration process. Your settings can gradually get out of adjustment. You know, you may want to check that application certainly at the beginning of the spray season, but if it is set there in between spray jobs, even in between spray jobs, and always start that calibration with cleaned out equipment. Pay attention to your ground speed. Faster does not mean better. Pay attention also to your sprayer pressure and ensure that you're operating at a safe, effective pressure. For your assistance with calibration, your county agent can help you get your calibrator spreaded, your sprayer calibrated rather. And the Noble Foundation has a fantastic, it's about a 7-minute video, and I've given you the YouTube link here. You will get my slides, so don't worry about writing that down. And then I've also referred you to 2 helpful publications, one by UGA on calibrating various type of sprayers, boom and boomless, along with dry applicators, and then one from the University of Tennessee. And I will admit that theirs is a little more user-friendly than ours, but refer to one and or both of those for calibration assistance. After the application, we want to maintain records. It is a requirement, a legal requirement, that licensed applicators record applications of restricted use pesticides. Commercial applicators have to record every pesticide application. That helps the applicator establish proof and history of proper use and professionalism in using these products. It helps us reduce mistakes, misuse, may save us money by improving our practices, making us more efficient with those products, many of which cost pretty good nickel. And those records will also show us how much product we used last time. Might give us an indication that of how much we need for the next job. So record and review those applications. We should keep records because the law requires us to, but it also demonstrates our professionalism and proper use of those products, verifying, recording that we are taking the safety, care, and concern when making that pesticide application. And if you ever get inspected by Department of Ag, those good records will make that process go easier. There is no standard form, so you do have flexibility to integrate any type record-keeping system that you would like. You are required to keep those records for 2 years, but with the everyone's becoming more stronger, familiar with computers, get a computer-based system and keep those records forever, but you must maintain them for 2 years. There are 9 required elements that are must be recorded, and those applications should be recorded within the first 14 days. Those 9 requirements are the name and certified applicator number, along with the product name, EPA registration number, how much was applied, the time, date, month, year of the application, the location, the application location, the commodity that was targeted, and the size of the treated area. The information I send you will include this form, which includes those 9 required elements, along with this one, and that rate per unit is not a federal requirement. So, but I think that's information that's valuable to you to remind yourself what rate you put it out, pint to the acre, 2 pints to the acre, and then it also allows you to evaluate the effectiveness of that application rate. So I'll share with you a record as well. I have listed some additional resources. I really encourage you to visit pesticidestewardship.org. It's a great website with just tons, I mean tons of valuable information to make you a better steward and user of our pesticides and our environmental resource. I'll send you the storage checklist as well. I did want to make these 2 announcements. Many of you are probably aware that Duo-Core received its label this year. It is a new broadleaf weed control for annual perennial forages brought to us from Corteva Agriscience. So that one is out there, and I'm hearing good things about its control. Corteva Agriscience also has another product coming called Pro Clova. It is not yet labeled, but it is anticipated in the second half of 2020. Pro Clova, as you may derive from that name, and this according to Corteva, is groundbreaking weed control solution to allow us to protect our desirable legumes such as white clover and Lespedeza. This is the first product labeled for use over the top of legumes, white clover, and Lespedeza, along with some others. So folks, that is the end of my session. If let me stop sharing, and we'll quickly see if there are questions from anyone. If you have a question on anything that I presented, let's take that now. If not, let's see, we had somebody else join us, right? I saw somebody else I thought join us. I'm not seeing their name in the participant list. So we still have 2 producers, and Paul, you or Brenda, one, give me a heads up on whether or not we think this is working.
So far, so good.
Far,
All
so
right,
good.
thank you, Paul. I will go right ahead into our next presenter, and want to thank my colleague over in Whitfield County, Brenda Jackson, for joining us today. Brenda joins us from the Murray County office, and Brenda, I have made you the host. So remember to jump that back to me once you're done. But Brenda, thank you for joining us, and it's all yours.
Thank you. I'm gonna see about sharing my screen and can everybody see that?
Yes, ma'am. Might want to expand it. You got it.
So, as Wade said, I'm over here in Murray County. I'm down in the valley as opposed to Walker County, so it's a little bit hotter down here than it is up there. I've run into a lot of situations here where weeds are telling us what's going on with the soil, basically. Some common mistakes that a lot of producers make with their herbicides, you know, you see listed here, the biggest one being, you know, not identifying the weed correctly, so not using the correct herbicide. But there are some cultural reasons as well, especially if the same weed keeps coming back, no matter how many times you hit it with a herbicide. So Wade already told us what a weed is. So what's an indicator plant? An indicator plant is one that grows in a specific location for a specific reason. And their presence will often reveal, you know, a specific status for that location. Maybe there's poor fertility. Maybe there's soil compaction. Maybe there's, you know, that soil stays wet for an extended period of time. And a lot of our weeds are more tolerant of these issues than our desirable forages are. So we can use them to tell us what's going on so that we can try and alleviate the cultural issue to improve our forage's chance of proliferation. And you will see a lot of repeats as we go through some of these weeds. So let's start with compacted soils. This is a platy soil structure that has limited soil pore space, basically meaning that there's no place for the water and the oxygen to go in the soil. We often get poor water infiltration down through the layers. It usually just runs off the soil surface like concrete. Some common weeds in these areas would be some of our rushes, some of our knotweeds, goosegrass, bitter sneezeweed, both do very well in compacted soils. Dog fennel and buttercup as well. We get a lot of this in the spring. Curly dock is another one. We don't see as much chicory up in this area. But to alleviate some of these issues, consider some of these options. Maybe consider an alternative forage in that space to help reduce the soil compaction, something that will maybe break through that compacted layer, like your forage radishes, your cereal rye, your alfalfas, red clover, sorghums, your native grasses like big blue stem, little blue stem. I have Bermudagrass in yellow here because it is a maybe for this situation. It's not a native grass to our area, and it is tolerant of overgrazing and drought, but it doesn't always have as deep a root system as some of the native grasses. And as you know, if you're growing Bermuda grass for pasture or hay, it needs additional nutrients for increased production. Also consider, your farming practices. If you can reduce the wheel traffic over your fields, combine activities to reduce the number of times you pass over that field, use wider tires on your tractor or sprayer, whatever you're using to spray with. Reduce the inflation in those tires also will, it's going to make a more bouncy ride for you, but it will have less impact on the field. And then again, if you can in areas where you maybe, have to till on a regular basis to prevent that hard pan, change your tillage depth from year to year to prevent a development of that hard pan. Changing it up every year, digging it up at different depths will move that hard pan around. Overgrazed land will often look very similar to compacted soils. You'll have a high weed population just by the excessive hoof tread and grazing, especially in areas that stay wet. Some indicator weeds for here would be horse nettle, bitter sneezeweed, amaranth, Bermudagrass, bluegrass, both the annual variety and the Kentucky variety, crabgrass, and even ironweed. And ironweed is a difficult one, by virtue of its name, it's a difficult one to spray and kill out once established. A longer recovery period will improve the vigor of the plants. This can be achieved through a rotational grazing system. Also, a lower stocking rate reduces stress on the grass, the soil, and on the livestock even. It'll also lower your stress because you're not having to worry about what to feed because you'll have additional forage available. If you do increase your fertility, a supplemental feed or the number of paddocks you use in your grazing rotation, you'll get taller grass to protect the soil. You'll get improved water filtration through the soil layers and lower soil temperatures. In general, the minimum recovery period for paddocks should be about 14 days, but you want to, don't go by the number of days, but by the grass height. If it hasn't reached that minimum starting height, then don't put any animals on it until you've reached that level. Cool season grasses need to be about 8 inches and warm season grasses 5 inches as a minimum height. In wet soils, the pore space between soil particles becomes so saturated with water that it will lead to a compacted soil situation. Those that collapsing soil particles fill those pores. It limits the root structure, the ability of the roots to spread. It will lead to increased decomposition as those roots start to rot, and as those roots rot, will decrease the biological processes of the plants. Basically what that means is the roots can't take up any nutrients in order to improve their survivability. Rushes and sedges all do very well in very wet soils. Varieties like spike rush and flat sedge, bulrush, buttonweed, smartweed, and this one is a reed called canary grass. To mitigate situations here, you're going to want to consider maybe creating a, hang on a minute, went forward, there we go. Consider creating a wetland location. Wetlands are important to many threatened and endangered, birds, plants, a lot of the frogs, the fishes, that type of thing. So consider, a conversation with your local NRCS office to maybe fence out that area and designate it as a wetland area, and and don't use those spots, especially if draining really isn't an option for you. NRCS could limit your cost share benefits if you try to drain a wetland, for example. Don't graze or travel in those areas when they're standing in water. Only use designated roads too, to minimize the wear on the land itself. And again, use forage species adapted to wetland areas like hairy vetch, switchgrass, gamma grass, that type of thing. In low fertility soils, you usually see this with a pH where the pH is less than 5 or greater than 7.5. Phosphorus can sometimes be a limiting factor for forage growth, especially if that land is used for hay. Potassium can also be a limiting factor as well in certain situations with pH. Weeds that prefer either more acidic or more basic soils would be something like rabbit tobacco, red sorrel, poorjoe, broom sedge. We see that in a lot of our pastures and hay fields. Vernal grass, oxeye daisies. Oxeye daisy you'll often see along, roadsides. Some of the panicums and yarrow as well. You can often do a plant tissue test in your local county extension office. They'll send it to the lab at the university to see if there's a specific nutrient your crop is deficient in, so that you'll know what needs to be improved on in your next fertilization practice. If you're feeding hay on low nutrient soils, this can relocate nutrients to that area just by virtue of having the cows grouped around the hay ring. They're literally returning nutrients to the soil out one end as the hay is going in the front. Short duration grazing with high density, which basically means, higher stocking rates, will improve the manure distribution. So basically a smaller paddock for a shorter period of time will spread that manure over the entire paddock versus in one favorite grazing area. You can always, of course, soil test and adjust your pH accordingly, using lime if needed. And then again, here's another one where you can use plants that are adapted to those particular soils, like your lespedezas and your native grasses. Severe deficiencies of a single nutrient can occur if the soil pH is too high or too low. Most of our pasture and hay forages prefer something in the range of soil pH of about 6 to 6.5. If you go below or above that, then you can get nutrient deficiencies as well as toxicity issues. So how in the world can we tell if we're having a nutrient deficiency? There's a way that you can identify how some of the nutrients are mobilizing within the plant and some of the impacts that those nutrients or the lack thereof are having on the plant based on the location of where that you're seeing the issues occur at. So say a yellow leaf towards the bottom, but the veining is still green might indicate that it's a nitrogen issue. A little further up on the plant may indicate that instead that it's magnesium, for example. And this is from Montana State University, a kind of a pathway to decide, a question and answer to decide, what's going on. Are the older leaves affected? If it's yes, and then you go down to the next box. How are they affected? Is it generalized? Are they dark or light green? If it's a yes, then you go down. If it's no, then you go to the right. And so forth. And that will kind of lead you to diagnosing some of the issues that are going on for yourself. And just to give you an idea of what some of these nutrient issues look like, these are all tomato plants with different deficiency issues, things that kind of, everything from not enough nitrogen to not enough zinc, not enough iron, which the nitrogen and the iron, for example, can all lead to yellowing, but the yellowing differs just a bit. And this is a similar image for what nutrient deficiencies in corn would look like. In a nitrogen deficient pasture, nutrient dense spots from manure or urine spots will show themselves to you. Basically, all of these green areas is where nutrients were dropped by the cattle, whereas the rest of the pasture is nitrogen deficient. Excess nitrogen combined with potassium deficiency is more likely to give stand declines and weed encroachment into the field. Potassium deficient stands are also less tolerant to winter injury and disease pressures. Some of the challenges with nitrogen, consider what you're planting and what your fertility was when you planted, and a soil test can help with this. What was the soil like? What was the weather at that time? What are your objectives specifically? Are you feeding the crop or are you feeding the soil, for example? Are you replacing what is lost when you harvest, which is what should be your goal? So whatever form of fertilizer you put out, the majority of the nitrogen will be released within the first 40 days. It's volatile and for that reason can't be tested for, but you can still soil test and monitor the trends in phosphorus, potassium, and soil pH. If your pH is too high or low, nitrogen can become fixed within the soil. But if the pH is in the correct range, it will mineralize into ammonium and nitrates, both of which are available to our plants. However, ammonium can also convert to ammonia, evaporating as gas, and nitrates can leach away in the soil, in saturated soils, or evaporate as gas as well. This is one of the reasons why we don't recommend fertilizing during hot, dry temperatures, because you're pretty much, the heat is just converting it. It helps with the conversion into ammonia, where it would lead to evaporation. It just volatilizes out of the soil. I went quick. Oh, hang on a minute. All right, I've stopped my share.
All right, well, thank you, Brenda. We have a few moments. Either one of our participants has a question for Brenda or backing up to my session. We've got a little bit of time for that. Hearing none, and being one who likes to stay on track, if everybody's good, we're just going to continue on.
Wait,
Mr.
can I
Howard?
pass it on to Roger?
Yes. Let's see.
All right.
Oh.
Roger, you should be the host now, so you can, I'll mute myself and you can take over.
Unmute your mic, Roger. Bottom left screen.
Trying again.
There you go, buddy.
So you got a slide and you can hear me.
Yes, sir.
Okay, thanks. So I chose to visit with folks a little bit about the Bermudagrass stem maggot, but as we think about this, it may be valuable to think about it in terms of how pests in general fit into agricultural and environmental system. So even if you're not concerned about the Bermudagrass stem maggot, maybe as we visit about this, knowing how the biology affects understanding a pest and then making recommendations about how to control that pest may be appropriate. So I am indebted to Dr. Lisa Baxter. She's the Extension Forage Specialist for the University of Georgia stationed in Tifton. And a large number of these slides came from the presentation she made at the Georgia Forages Conference this year, which was a virtual conference. And this was the presentation she made talking about the first 10 years of research trying to understand this new pest. And let me emphasize by way of this slide that we live in an area, because of long growing season, high humidity, proximity to the Atlantic and Gulf of Mexico, and area of high travel with Atlanta, that we are exposed to the very high probability of introduction of exotic pests. And that can happen intentionally. Historic exotic pest like kudzu was introduced because it's a great forage plant. And much more recently, concern now about the longhorn tick, which last I knew was not in Georgia, but is in neighboring states. And for any of these problems, producers are really the first line in identifying that there's a problem and recognizing that something's unusual is going on. And so the emergence of the problem with Bermudagrass stem maggot was because producers reported that there was a strange appearance in their fields. In the middle of the summertime, looked like the field had been frosted. And so it took some close observation, but the symptom was the death of the highest leaves on the tiller. And it turned out that there was a stem maggot, fly larva, that was within that Bermudagrass stem and was feeding at the base of that that very last terminal leaf on the tiller. And so the cycle of the adult fly laying eggs in the tiller and the larva emerging and feeding on them leads to the symptom of the death of those leaves. So first recognized, actually the Bermudagrass stem maggot had been identified in California as a turf pest decades ago, but had not been a problem in Bermudagrass production until 2010. And so it's was first recognized in the southeast in Georgia, but has now been identified in most of the surrounding states. So 10 years, progress has been made, identified first, initial preliminary variety screening, replicated research and control. In 2013, it was recognized as a major pest. First scientific manuscripts were published in 2014. Variety screening and field research initiated in 15. The extension bulletin about Bermudagrass stem maggot management was published in 2017. And an economic analysis, which involved cooperative work with a number of county agents, was done in 2018, and continuing research going on beginning in 2019. It's taken a multidisciplinary approach, so it's not just the entomologists, it's not just the weed scientists. It takes everybody to understand the biology of the pest. So the initial observation also appeared that the damage was greater in fine-stemmed Bermudagrasses. So those that have a narrow stem, such as common Bermudagrass, Alicia, turns out Russell is very similar compared to the wider stem varieties such as Difton 85, and also characterized by wider leaves compared to the narrower leaves. And so in that screening, it turned out that the wide-stemmed varieties, which have more or less stargrass influence in them, are less susceptible than the finer stemmed materials. And so looking at just the number of stems that were infected, the fine stem materials were much more susceptible than those that had some level of stargrass influence in them. So declining susceptibility as the increase in that actually Cynodon nymphoensis is a different species, but it is can be manipulated and crossed with Cynodon dactylon, which is the normal Bermudagrass. So the initial recommendations based on the life cycle of the fly were to spray 7 to 10 days after harvest, and then optionally a second application for flies that would emerge after that initial application. So the only recommended insecticide are the pyrethroid insecticides, using them again at the label grade. And that's based on this approximately 20-day life cycle of the fly to the larva and back to the adult fly. And so it's the adult fly, because the larva is essentially encased within the Bermudagrass stem, that makes it very difficult to control. And so the target organism that we're trying to control is that adult fly. So it's possible to achieve high levels of control with multiple applications, but it's important to consider the economics and the impact on production when considering application strategies. And so if we consider when the damage is occurring, it's nearly always late in the season. There was one case where the sprayed material was more damaged in May. Sorry, the unsprayed material was more damaged in May. But most of the damage occurs that's significant in July or afterwards. And so the damage is most severe late July to mid-September. And so when you're thinking about control strategies, knowing when that's going to happen influences decision about when to make pesticide applications. So there was on-farm research that was conducted in more than 14 counties, mostly in South Georgia. The other important management activity is scouting fields and knowing when the fly is approaching economic levels. But the other thing that they learned was looking at sweeps. So this is the number of flies from 60 swings with a net. At 11 o'clock, they got many more hits than later in the day. And then they also looked at the height of a sticky card, how many adult flies would be captured at those different heights. And so from that kind of observation, the conclusion is that the adult fly is most likely to be in the canopy earlier in the morning, and it's going to be deeper in the canopy, not higher than a foot or so. So those characteristics suggest that pesticide should be applied with large volumes of water, that the boom should be set low to get low in the canopy, and sprayed early in the morning when the adult flies are most likely to be present. They're also working on using some growth models to use growing degree days instead of just the number of days to more accurately target appropriate application times. And so the yield as a function of growing degree days at first application is the way that they're looking at that. And the damage is much greater at 100 and 400 growing degree days than it is in between that. So by using some regression, they can identify the optimum point for the first insecticide application. So reviewing damage to Bermudagrass is most severe after the late July, and have to be careful about whether or not chemical control will be profitable outside of that time. So what else influences the damage that results from presence of stem maggot? We don't always understand exactly why, but we know that relative humidity, rainfall, and undergrazing, maintaining a large canopy, will increase the damage to Bermudagrass. Extreme heat and drought and canopy disruption, either from haying or from heavy grazing, will reduce the impact of the Bermudagrass stem maggot. And so remember, in the flash drought we had recently, they modified their recommendations about timing of insecticide application and said, actually wait until you see evidence of presence of the fly before you make that application of insecticide. So insecticides are only effective when the fly is present. So in times of drought, delay application. So humidity, rainfall, undergrazing will increase the population, heat, drought, and harvester grazing decreases the population. So unnecessary insecticide applications are potentially more expensive than the yield loss that results from the damage to the Bermudagrass. So if a population is present, there will be some yield loss to the hay crop but it may amount to fewer dollars than actually the cost of insecticide application. So for instance, assume that there's a 100-acre hayfield of one of the susceptible varieties, the fine textured varieties. Weekly insecticide applications would cost $13,000. Without insecticide, that the hay is still worth $4,000. So chemical control is not always economic with low levels of stem maggot damage. So BSM may cause yield and economic losses, but unnecessary insecticide applications are more costly. And that gets to the whole notion of knowing the threshold of any pest where the damage or the loss exceeds the cost of whatever the intervention is, if it's a herbicide or an insecticide or even some kind of management input. So weekly insecticide applications would result in a $13,000 net loss, despite 15 to 20% increase in the yield of those Bermudagrass varieties. If left entirely unsprayed, the producer would still have a hay crop that he could sell with about a $4,000 profit. So it's also worth considering how Bermudagrass stem maggot presence and potential damage interacts with the other part of the environment that we have some impact on in terms of harvest management, fertilization, and weed control. So the bronzed canopy, but there's also some leaf spot damage perhaps, and some weed invasion. So this is the crossroads, the nexus between forage production and control of forage pests. So the more competitive the forage is, the less impact from this particular pest. And I think that's a generalization that's quite true in most ag production systems, particularly in forages. But I think in any crop, the more, the healthier the crop is, the more productive, the more competitive the crop is, the less impact there will be from potential pests. So good harvest management, good fertility, strategic use of pesticides, meaning only when it's economically possible or profitable, leads to better control of the pest. So a strategic integrated pest management and a forage management plan is key. More competitive forage, less potential Bermudagrass stem maggot damage. The other approach, so we've talked some about chemical control of the adult fly, but the other possibility is to identify resistant cultivars. And so we did mention that those varieties that are currently available that have a thicker stem, some stargrass influence, appear to be more resistant than the finer stem materials. But Dr. Bill Anderson, who's ARS scientist in Tifton, is pursuing the identification of additional varieties that may have even more tolerance. So the objectives are to select highly tolerant and productive Bermudagrass lines and then evaluate those Bermudagrass breeding lines for yield. And so in Tifton, they have basically a worldwide collection, the core nursery that has many different kinds of Bermudagrass. And so the initial was screening of that collection to identify materials that demonstrated some resistance. And so higher numbers here mean more Bermudagrass stem maggot damage. And so the range is from, at the Florida location, from less than 1 to more than 7, and at Tifton from just over 1 to 5. Again, the pattern of yield loss is after late July, so August and September damage is more frequent than later in the season, earlier in the season. So this is some promising materials that were harvested for 3 years, and then looking at the loss due to, so this is sprayed versus unsprayed plots. So even Tifton 85 suffered a 30% loss with frequent herbicide or insecticide applications, but Jigs and Alicia a much greater loss. But some of the plant introductions and a breeding line losses in comparing sprayed to unsprayed were generally less than 20%, and some approaching only a 10% loss, thus demonstrating considerable tolerance. So conclusions: tolerance to Bermudagrass stem maggot has been found within the core collection, and tolerance has been persistent and is significantly better than current cultivars. And so those liens will continue to be evaluated and increased for use for breeding. Now, one note, the stargrass materials and those that include stargrass germplasm tend to be less cold tolerant than some of the finer stem materials. And so we're working with Dr. Anderson to look at some of those promising materials at the station at Rome, and trying to identify not only material that is tolerant to the Bermudagrass stem maggot, but may also be productive in colder temperature environment. So thanks for your attention and recognition that much of the research that has identified and revealed the information about the Bermudagrass stem maggot has been provided by support from the Georgia Beef Commission. And also that it was always collaborative work with multiple institutions. And I'm gonna stop my share and would certainly welcome questions if there are any.
Any questions from our participants? While they're thinking of one, baby, Roger, I got one. What type of presence have you seen in your research plots down at Northwest Farm?
So it was really conspicuous last year. The two susceptible varieties, Alicia and Russell, had that frosted appearance. I had to look pretty hard. I could find that dead tiller in some of the promising introduction materials, but it was much less conspicuous.
Not much presence this summer?
Haven't seen any yet.
Well, that's good. That's good. But a question from either of our participants? Okay, Joe, I see you signed off, so you'll be good for an hour's credit, my friend. Okay.
Yeah, I need to leave to head out to go somewhere. Thank you for this,
You'll be-
Wade.
Yes, sir. You'll be good for an hour's credit.
Okay, bye-bye.
Good day. And so that brings us to our last presenter this morning. Our colleague in Bartow County Extension, Paul Pugliese, has he offered up, I think, an excellent topic. I'm looking forward to hearing his comments on herbicide carryover and not giving your neighbor crap. So, Paul, thanks for joining us, and teach us, buddy.
You're going to share?
Oh,
Give me the share.
yes. Oh, it doesn't give me that right anymore. Roger, can you check to see if you can swap that over to Paul? I don't have that option right at the moment. Roger, you're muted. We can't hear you.
I'm still the host. How do I?
Stop screen share or next to your name.
Go to the participant list, scroll over to Paul's name under more, click make him the host. That's how I had to do it for you.
Yep. Okay.
I got it.
Yay.
All right. Well, thank you, Wade. I appreciate the invitation to come speak today. And I want to say hello from Bartow County. I'm the County Extension Coordinator down here in Cartersville, where my office is located. And today I want to talk to you all about the effects of pasture herbicides that we use every day and the potential carryover effects of those herbicides into situations that you may not think a lot about. People a lot of times want to collect manure from farms and give it to their neighbors, and we unfortunately end up getting those calls and complaints at the local county extension office when we see the effects of those on trees and vegetable garden crops and that sort of thing. This is a very, very common problem, unfortunately. And it's also a very timely topic in a sense, because one of the herbicides that we're talking about today is a chemical that's under a lot of scrutiny right now in the row crop industry. If you're familiar with the dicamba-ready crops or the oxen-tolerant type crops, they have just lost that registration. A federal judge struck down the use of that product and has taken that away from our row crop farmers. So that's one less tool that they have available now for weed management. And if we're not careful as an industry, that could trickle down to other uses of some of these chemicals. As of right now, pasture products that are labeled with dicamba are still safe. But again, this is something that's under a lot of scrutiny. I think it's something that we need to increase awareness of amongst cattle producers, hay buyers, and everyone that uses hay and manure in this industry needs to be aware of this issue. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So just to kind of give you a quick overview about this chemical class, essentially we're dealing with what are called auxin chemicals. And so that's a very broad sort of generalization about this group. And there's 40 different chemical classes out there, and this group, they call it group number 4. If you ever look at your pesticide label, it tells you the mode of action. You don't have to know the fancy terminology, you just know group 4. And if you ever need to rotate to a different chemistry, you just pick a different number, a group 3 or group 1, and that'll give you a different mode of action if you're trying to avoid resistance with certain weeds and that sort of thing. But essentially, these herbicides act as plant growth regulators. And so we call that a synthetic auxin type treatment. And those synthetic auxins essentially mimic growth hormones in plants. And we actually use these auxin type hormones or synthetic hormones for plant propagation. In fact, if you're familiar with taking cuttings in a garden type situation or in a greenhouse propagation environment, we actually dip those cuttings in these synthetic auxins to increase the ability of rooting in those cuttings. So essentially, it causes those roots to grow faster. It causes rapid cell division, which is a good thing when we're talking about plant propagation. But essentially, these herbicides do that to the point where it's uncontrolled cell division and growth, and literally the plant just sort of grows itself to death. And that's how the herbicide essentially kills weeds in your pasture. These are very selective herbicides in the sense that they kill broadleaf weeds. They do not hurt grass species. So you can spray it over the top of your pasture and you won't see any damage to your Bermudagrass or your fescue. But realize too that broadleaf weeds is very broad in the sense that there's no discrimination there between a dandelion or a thistleweed in your pasture versus a tree or a shrub or anything else that's a broadleaf plant is potentially susceptible to these herbicides. These herbicides are commonly used in lawns and pastures, and they're really very popular because of their low toxicity. They have very, very low toxicity levels to mammals, humans, animals, even aquatic environments. There are labels to be able to use for weed control in ponds and that sort of thing. So it's a very safe herbicide from a toxicity standpoint, and that's why it's such a popular group of herbicides. We break these herbicides down to a couple of different chemical classes or subclasses. The phenoxy group is probably the most familiar group to a lot of folks. The old-fashioned 2,4-D that's been around since the 1940s is still a very popular herbicide today. And in fact, it's used in a lot of formulations as a combination type product, and they'll mix it with some of these other chemicals that are listed here. The benzoic acids, the most common example of that you'll see in the pasture and forage industry is dicamba, which we just talked about. And then the third group of these auxin chemicals is the carboxylic acids. And these are some of the stronger versions of these auxin chemicals that have a tendency to linger quite a bit longer in the soil. Picloram, clopyrrolid are some of the more common ones that you're familiar with, triclopyr. The one that Wade mentioned earlier, the new herbicide called Duracor, is a combination of aminopyrrolid and fluorpyroxafen, which is a new chemical class. But again, these all have that same auxin group 4 mode of action, essentially. Again, you're more often than not, when you buy a product like Weed Master, that's a combination product. So that's a combination of 2,4-D and dicamba. You could buy those herbicides and mix it and make your own Weed Master if you wanted to, for example. But the advantage of having more than one chemical in that mix is it's going to give you a broader range of weed control than just 2,4-D or any one herbicide alone, which helps with trying to clean up some of those tougher weeds in that pasture or forage situation. Again, these are very familiar brands that you've probably heard of before. On the left-hand column there, you can see some of the brand names that are very popular in the pasture and forage industry. Products such as Forefront, Grazon, both the Grazon Next and Grazon P&D. They're both auxin herbicides. It's just a different chemical combination there. Aminopyrrolid, which is the Milestone formula, Redeem, Surmount, Remedy, those are all good pasture and forage herbicides that y'all are probably familiar with. Realize too that these same herbicides are used in turf grass and lawn applications around homes and golf courses and that sort of thing. It's more or less the exact same chemicals, they just have different brand names. And they have a separate label for those as far as appropriate use and safety precautions that you have to follow in those situations. So again, you always have to buy the product that's labeled for your use. So you shouldn't use a turf grass herbicide on your hay field and vice versa, because again, each one of those has a different label for that particular use. So let's talk a little bit about the fate of these herbicides in the soil, and realize that all chemicals sooner or later do break down. And it's just a matter of time. But unfortunately, these auxin herbicides have a tendency to linger in the soil for a period of time. Some break down faster than others. You get more rapid breakdown of these herbicides in warm, moist soil. Microbial action is going to be more active in those soil conditions where there's a lot of moisture and warmth. So that's going to accelerate the breakdown of these herbicides. And then the other really key part of breaking these down is through photodegradation. So essentially, sunlight will accelerate that breakdown as well. As far as, the average, we're looking at 3 to 6 months is kind of the half-life on these chemicals for them to break down. Some will break down faster than others. 2,4-D breaks down in about a month. Some of the stronger herbicides that we talked about can last 6 months, 8 months, even 12 months in some situations, especially if the conditions are right. In cooler soil, drier soil conditions, you're going to see the residual activity even longer in those situations. These herbicides, of course, the longer they stay out there and the longer they take to break down, there's more potential for leaching of those herbicides or runoff through soil movement and that sort of thing. So that's something you have to be thinking about when you apply these herbicides. Where's it going to move downhill from now, from where you're spraying that? Realize that most applications are not going to go very deep in our clay soils, at most maybe an inch. But if you're on a sandy soil in South Georgia, or on a river bottom up here with more of a sandy loam or something like that, you can see those herbicides move a little bit further into that soil profile. And also they can move off the surface too immediately after you spray a product. If you get a heavy rain within an hour or two of that product, it's going to move more readily on the surface. Also, if it's applied to very dry soils, it can wash into those soil cracks through rain or irrigation. And again, you can see movement of those herbicides down into that soil profile, which is, again, a concern, especially if you have trees and other things that are nearby in that pasture that could potentially take up these herbicides. So looking at these herbicides a little bit further as far as their movement, the big concern here today that I wanted to focus on is hay and manure. And realize, because they have the ability to linger for these, extended periods of time, it's going to also linger in hay that you harvest from that field. And it's also going to linger in the manure that comes out of those animals that are eating that hay as well. So when we're talking about hay specifically, if we put that hay in a bale, in a barn type situation, it's dark. And it's a dry situation, and so it can last several years. Sometimes inside of a hay bale, you still have residual activity of those herbicides. It doesn't break down inside of that barn because, again, the key there is photodegradation. Also realize that if an animal grazes a pasture or eats hay that has these herbicide residues on it, again, it's not a concern from a safety standpoint as far as those animals are concerned. But those herbicides can remain in the digestive tract of that animal for 3 to 7 days. And so a lot of labels you'll see, recommend taking animals off of that pasture or, taking them off of that hay for at least a week to clear the manure out of their system and any residues before you move that animal to another situation where maybe you don't want those herbicide residues. Maybe you're going to go, graze some stubble in a row crop area or something like that for rotational grazing, and you may not want those herbicide residues out there where you're going to plant back with a row crop later. So again, these herbicides can linger, and there's a lot of ways that they can move that you have to be aware of. Also, just piling up manure. A lot of people, especially horse stables and that sort of thing, are really guilty of piling up the manure in what we call a passive pile. That's not really a compost situation. If it's just sitting in a pile, it's not being turned. So there's really no sunlight getting in the center of that pile. And that's going to be a very, very slow process as far as that breaking down. And again, we're looking at months, maybe even years for that chemical to continue to break down. And then, if we do have a situation where any herbicides carry over for whatever reason, let's say we put in manure into a garden situation, you really don't know if it's safe unless you do what's called a bioassay, which is basically planting a test crop in that area to see how it responds. And if there's any symptoms of chemical activity or uptake of that chemical, then obviously it's not safe to plant that crop yet. You're going to have to wait longer before you come back and replant in that area. So looking at the fate of these herbicides, as far as the different types, more specifically, a lot of these, like the 2,4-D formulations, come in a mean salt form, which is a good thing for a pasture application, especially if you're spraying your trees and that sort of thing that you don't want to get drift injury. The amine salt forms are less volatile compared to your ester formulations. And so that's a good thing. That's what you want, especially if you got neighbors down the road. You don't want drift or volatilization of that herbicide to carry over through wind and that sort of thing. But sort of the converse of that, you know, they are less volatile, but they're more water soluble. And so they're going to move in soil, they're going to move in manure, they're going to leach out of hay more readily because they are water soluble. And that's just, you know, that's the consequence of using an amine salt formulation. So there's a, you know, there's a good and a bad side to that. And whenever you see these amine salt forms, the label's going to usually say, you know, be careful about spraying near desirable plants. Watch out for the root zone of those trees and shrubs, which is very vague sometimes. You know, what is the root zone of that tree or shrub? Well, that's going to depend on the size of that tree and the age of that tree as far as, you know, what it would be safe as far as being able to spray safely near those plants. And realize these same chemicals are ones that we use maybe in lawn situations as well. And so you have to be careful spraying near trees in a lawn situation. And also, you know, exceeding the recommended rate. You know, you should always follow the labeled rate, the number of applications. You know, you don't want to exceed that in any given time frame. Usually, you know, it's going to limit you to how many applications per year and a certain maximum labeled rate as well. So looking at, you know, what are the symptoms of these different herbicides? You know, for the most part, they all cause similar, you know, rapid growth in those weeds, as we talked about earlier, or accelerated growth. But the symptoms are subtly different. For 2,4-D specifically, we see, you know, when an herbicide is killing that weed, we'll see twisting of the leaf petiole, which is where the leaf attaches to the stem. The fancy word for that is epinasty, and basically it looks like a pig's tail. That's the best way I can explain that. So if you know what a pig's tail looks like, you can sort of just twist it up, taking that leaf petiole or that stem and just literally twisting it up. That's what it would look like. You'll also see cupping of leaves on certain plants if they're susceptible to 2,4-D. This could be drift. It could also be take up through the roots. So downward cupping of the leaves is another symptom of that type of damage. Narrow strap-like leaves on very young growth. A lot of these herbicides move to the newest growth on the plant first, and so the youngest leaves are going to show those symptoms more quickly. So you get this sort of shoestring or strap-like leaf effect on the newest growth. Also realize that it can look like maybe a lot of other diseases that are out there. Insect damage occasionally can look like this. So you need to rule out those as possibilities if you're trying to troubleshoot this type of herbicide damage. There's even certain viruses that can look like this as well. So being able to rule that out is really important if you're trying to troubleshoot. So here's some classic examples of the herbicide injury that we expect from 2,4-D. In the big picture on the lower right, we have a tomato plant. More than likely, manure was introduced into that vegetable garden, and we see the twisting and curling of the leaves. The leaves are very narrow and strap-like, not the normal tomato leaf that you would expect to see there. And again, it tends to be more dramatic on the newest growth of that tomato plant, is where you're going to see those symptoms first. In the upper left-hand corner, you have a soybean plant where you're seeing that downward cupping and buckling of the leaves and sort of, you know, really rapid cell division there. So the leaves are sort of crinkled looking because the cells are dividing so quickly. And eventually this could also, you know, kill that plant as well. But that's kind of the first or early stages that you would expect to see on tomatoes and beans as well. We can also see these same types of symptoms on trees. So, you know, let's say you had an oak tree in the middle of your pasture. This is the type of damage you might expect to see on an oak tree, where you see that leaf strapping again or curling. Some of the leaves may be distorted or stunted in growth. And so the tree just doesn't leaf out very quickly, especially if it was hit in the early springtime, or it may not leaf out at all if it got enough of that herbicide through root uptake. Drift injury, you know, if you're spraying on a windy day or something like that, it might affect just sort of, you know, one event, if you will, if, you know, one set of leaves on that tree, but the newest leaves would maybe grow out of that or be normal if it was a drift injury. But if it's soil uptake, you know, let's say they got grass clippings or manure or something around this tree, you know, your cows may be, you know, chewing their cud and sitting under that tree all day long where it's shady. If enough of that manure accumulates underneath that tree, then the whole tree is going to show symptoms. All the growth that comes out is going to be, continually impacted by those herbicide residues. So the next group is the dicamba type herbicides, which is Banful, Clarity, and the Weed Master combination with 2,4-D. Again, similar symptoms with leaf curling and twisting, but one other symptom that's unique for dicamba is you see veins that tend to be more parallel. And the picture there in the lower right-hand corner is a grape leaf, where you can see the veins, instead of being net-like or branching out like they should normally, they're kind of all in rows with those veins on the leaf. Also, the veins on dicamba injury or the leaves from dicamba injury tend to cup upward rather than downward. Again, that's a subtle difference between 2,4-D and dicamba. Sometimes you'll see shorter growth on the new growth as far as the buds and putting out new branches or leaves. You get sort of a witch's broom effect. You'll see swelling of the shoots. And abnormal elongation of the leaves is another symptom that you'll see sometimes as well. So this is a great example of dicamba injury where you get that upward cupping. This is actually on a redbud tree. I see this every spring in my backyard. Actually, my dad has a pasture right next to our house, and we have several redbud trees along the fence border there. And even though he tries to stay as far away as possible from our redbud trees along that forest edge there, there's always a little bit of drift that'll carry over, and redbuds are very sensitive to this, more so than any other plant. I can't find any other plant in my backyard that shows these symptoms, but the redbuds always get a little bit of drift injury just because they're so sensitive. And again, because that's a drift situation, only one set of leaves is going to be impacted by that. And then a few weeks later, when it puts out new leaves, those new leaves are perfectly normal at that point. So drift injury is going to get, again, sort of just be a one-time event. One set of leaves is going to be affected rather than the whole tree. But again, if we saw root uptake of this herbicide, let's say I put some manure around that tree, then the whole tree would be affected for the entire season or maybe longer. This is the third class, the triclopyr herbicide remedy is a good example of that. And this is one that, an example of a client that had some tulip poplar trees in their pasture. And if you're familiar with tulip poplar trees, they normally have a leaf like you see in the upper right-hand corner here that's, sort of like a cat's face is how I describe the normal leaf shape. But you can see in this picture, the leaves were very curled and cupped downward in this particular case. The client that brought these leaves to me said all the poplar trees along our fence line are curling up and dying. He thought it was drought stress. And even though we had actually been getting pretty good rain that summer, he brought the leaves to me. When you touch the leaves, they're not wilted. You can feel that they're not wilted. They're actually still very stiff. So that means they're fully hydrated in that sense. But they're distorted. They're literally growing in a deformed shape. And so that cupping and that bending of those veins is a classic example of triclopyr injury on a tulip poplar, which, by the way, is another one that's very sensitive. So what happened in this situation was this farmer had sprayed his pasture, and then within an hour or two after spraying, we found out that there was a heavy downpour of rain that moved this herbicide through surface runoff into the trees nearby his pasture. So looking at herbicide injury on, just want to make sure you guys can still hear me here.
Yes, I'm good.
Okay. Looked like your picture froze up on me. Looking at diagnosing injury, you could do a soil test if you wanted to see if the herbicide was in your garden or wherever you put some manure or something like that. But it's a very expensive test to troubleshoot for that. It's about $100 through our soil lab at the University of Georgia. So it's a very specific test, and you have to know what group of herbicides you're testing for to narrow that down. You can't just test for every herbicide that's out there. So each group of herbicides is going to cost you $100 if you want to test for it. The plant tissue analysis, let's say you collect some leaves off of that tree or whatever crop that's potentially injured by that herbicide. Again, that would be $100 probably to do plant tissue analysis. So those are very expensive options to try to troubleshoot that. Again, field diagnostics, you can look at, the timing of that injury within a few days or a week of that application. If you got trees nearby, you want to look at not just that one tree that you found, but look at other weeds, other trees that are nearby that you didn't intend to spray. But if you see more than one species affected by, the herbicide, or if they were impacted by that herbicide, they're going to be all showing, some sort of twisting or curling or stunting, so look for more than one species. Because more than often than not, if it's an insect or a disease or something else that's causing that problem, that's going to be very plant specific. Whereas herbicide injury is not going to be plant specific. It can affect all broadleaf plants and trees in that same area. So that uniformity is a good clue when it's affecting multiple plants in the same area. That's a good clue that it's probably herbicide injury in that situation. So just to quickly look at a couple of warning statements that you'll see on typical herbicide labels. And so this is taken from a Grazon herbicide label. It is a restricted use pesticide, but again, the Grazon Next formula, even though that one's not restricted use, it's still a group 4 auxin herbicide. So you're going to see the same types of warnings on both herbicides, whether it's restricted use or not in this situation, okay? And the very first thing it says under that restricted use label is that it may injure susceptible non-target plants. That means anything that comes in contact with trees, shrubs, whatever, is going to potentially be injured by this herbicide. The next statement there, you'll see on the label, it says it should not be applied in residential or commercial areas near ornamental trees and shrubs. So again, your landscape, your garden, you don't want these herbicides anywhere near those plants. And then it has a warning underneath that are circled that says trees can be affected by root uptake of the herbicide. So again, these are soil mobile, they're water soluble herbicides, they can carry over. And again, some of these similar herbicides like dicamba is used in turf grass applications. And so you may be mowing your grass and blow the grass clippings over into the trees, and you're going to see some herbicide carryover. I know a lot of folks, may bale hay in a pasture and then they'll stick those hay bales over on the tree line to get them out of the way. Well, again, some of those herbicides might leach out of that hay bale and affect those trees that are nearby through root uptake of that herbicide. So there's a lot of ways that these things can move. And then the next warning statement there at the bottom, it says, do not transfer livestock from treated grazing areas to broadleaf crop areas without allowing 7 days for those animals to allow that to pass through their system before you move those animals. Because again, you don't want that carryover in their urine or manure into other areas that you maybe don't intend those herbicides to end up. And now more and more, I'm seeing a lot of herbicide labels have this little visual forage and manure management. Basically, they want you to keep all manure and all hay on your farm, and it should never leave that farm. You don't want to give manure to your neighbor. You don't want to let them compost it, put it in their garden. You don't want them to use hay bales that have the herbicide in it for mulch, because again, these are all things that can move those herbicides into unintended areas. So keep that in mind when you're using these herbicides. What is the end user of the manure or hay that you're trying to sell? And then, a couple more warnings that you'll see, on the label, and it says this on just about every label. There's so many warnings on there that it's hard to miss. If you're going to try to come back into a pasture and overseed that with clover, for example, or any other legume, it says seeding of legumes may not be successful because, again, there's residual activity of this herbicide that's a broadleaf herbicide. You're not going to be able to grow clover there for at least a year, probably, depending on the chemical that we're talking about. So it'll tell you sometimes on the label that you can, replant within a certain time frame. So you need to watch those replant intervals very closely and read the label to see when and if you can reseed or overseed with clover or whatever broadleaf crop you want to go back in there with. And again, if you do have problems, or if you have it in a field that you want to plant back into another crop, you're going to have to do a short test, or a short test row, I should say. So you plant in strips across that field randomly with clover or whatever you're wanting to test with, flag it out, come back and check it in a couple of weeks. If nothing's growing there, or if the leaves are twisting and curling on you, then you really can't go back in there and plant just yet. So you're going to have to wait a little bit longer. Also realize too that there are restrictions on the number of applications So at the very bottom of the screen there, it says make no more than 2 applications per year with Grazon. So that's the maximum that you could apply. It also has a maximum rate at 16 pints per year. So even though you may be able to put out a couple of pints each time, you still should not do more than 2 applications per year. Again, because they're trying to give enough time for that herbicide to break down before you apply it again, and minimize some of those carryover issues as well. Because it sort of accumulates, if you will, in that soil, and that can be potentially a problem if you were going to plant back there, or if you had trees in the area and that sort of thing that are sensitive. So what is that area of concern? Real briefly, it says don't spray within the drip line of trees. Well, everybody's got a tree in the middle of a pasture somewhere, probably, or near the edge of the pasture. And so, how close can you get without causing damage? Again, it depends on the age of that tree. We know that older trees have very extensive root systems that can go out 2 to 3 times the canopy width of that tree. So if you look at the picture at the bottom of the screen here, that's sort of a classic textbook example of what a mature tree root system looks like. So you can see that those roots extend well out beyond at least twice the width of the canopy or the drip line of that tree. Tree roots, sort of an urban myth that tree roots go down. They really don't go very deep. They actually go wide, especially in our heavy clay soils here in Georgia. You might get 18 inches at most from tree rooting. So instead of going down, they have to go out to support that tree. Again, more than 50% of the tree's roots can extend beyond that drip line. So is it safe to park a hay bale out there? Is it safe to, have cows sitting under that tree chewing their cud? Those are things you need to think about. And where are you putting those hay, those manure, and those things like that? Where do they end up? There's certain trees that are known to be highly sensitive to these herbicides. Some of the ones that I've had a lot of encounters with are oaks, redbud trees, and poplars. But there's quite a list of trees that could potentially be impacted by these herbicides. As far as other crops that can be impacted, a lot of vegetable crops are highly sensitive to these herbicides. But just in general, any vegetables with the exception of corn, because corn is technically a grass, pretty much anything in a vegetable garden could be impacted by this, which underscores the reason why you don't want to put manure in your garden if it's been treated with these herbicides in a pasture or hayfield situation. Tomatoes are very, very sensitive to these herbicides. In fact, they could even be used as an indicator plant in a garden. If you put manure in there and you want to see, well, is it safe or not? That tomato plant will let you know very quickly within a few days or a week if it's got some herbicides in it. And again, I see this situation a lot, especially in residential areas, because these landscapers are out there spraying the exact same types of herbicides, 2,4-D, dicamba, triclopyr. They're labeled for lawn use, and you can see the mulch island around this tree is barely big enough to cover even half the canopy of that tree. So you can look at the lawn and tell there's not one weed in that lawn. So they're doing a good job with their weed control out there. But there's been, unfortunately, in this situation, root uptake of that herbicide, because we know the roots are way out in that lawn. They're taking up this chemical. The tree just didn't leaf out this spring, or it did try to. You can see there's a little bit of green on that canopy. And a little bit of green that is on there, you get all this distorted growth. You get the pigtails, the curling, and then you get some enlarged leaves in the background there. So all this weird distorted growth on the tree. And a tree like this, if that's as much as it leaves out, it's probably not going to recover. That's going to finish that tree off. It's going to starve to death from the lack of leaves out there. It can't take up enough sunlight to feed itself. In that situation, just to give you an example, we did do a foliage test. We did plant tissue analysis through our lab at UGA, and the only chemical that came back positive on that was 2,4-D. And you can see there at the rate of 0.52 parts per million is what showed up in the canopy of that tree. And again, this was the root absorption of that herbicide carried over from grass clippings or the roots actually getting out in the lawn in that situation. So it just shows you how easy it is to take up these herbicides. And we know that the lowest residue level of 2,4-D that can produce symptoms in these types of trees is 0.02 parts per million. That's all it takes to start seeing damage. Then the next question is it going to kill that tree? And unfortunately, nobody can answer that. Only time will tell. So can it recover? It all depends on the health of that tree. You know, low doses, it might recover with time and grow out of it, but we're talking years, 2, 3 years or seasons before those symptoms start to dissipate and go away. Because again, these are systemic herbicides that are in that tree. They're going to stay there. So it's not going to go away anytime soon. And there's nothing you can really do. There's no way to reverse that damage. All you can do is try to fertilize that tree and water it and prune it properly and give it a chance. But it may starve to death in the time frame that it takes to recover. And when we're talking about vegetable crops and things like tomatoes, they only live for 1 season. And so they really don't have time to recover. So whenever I have a client that brings me a tomato plant that's growing up, I say pull it out and start over or plant somewhere else. And you're going to have to wait and see when it's safe to go back and plant in that area. So the question is, who's to blame here? Unfortunately, a lot of people want to point fingers in all directions. The hay producer, obviously, he's doing a good job, producing high quality hay with no weeds in it because that's what his customers are demanding, right? These horse owners are wanting to buy high quality hay without any weeds in it. The only way you're going to do that is by using these herbicides, okay? And so he's doing a good job producing high quality hay. Well, then the hay buyer, may not even think to ask, well, are there herbicides in this hay? And so then they feed it to their horses or their cattle. They clean out those horse stables or the dairy barns or whatever, and they pile up this manure. And then after a while, they got a ton of this stuff surplus behind the barn. What are we going to do with it? Well, you call up your neighbor and say, hey, you want some free manure? It's been sitting out here for 5 years. It should be fine. Knock yourself out. I'm not even going to charge you if you just get it out of here, okay? So now who's responsible? Because they bought the hay, but they may not have even known that that hay field was sprayed with the herbicide, okay? Much less understand the fact that this can carry over in the manure for years afterwards. And then you also got the farm manager that's spraying these herbicides on his pasture. Is he thinking about, where his cattle are going next, to the next buyer? Or when he rotates his cattle to a new pasture, if he's leasing land, does he communicate to that owner that he's leasing the land from that, oh, by the way, there might be some herbicide carryover here. If you're wanting to come back and plant some soybeans out here next year, that might be a concern, okay? So there's another one that we could potentially blame. And you could even blame EPA or the herbicide manufacturer. Are the labels too vague? Do they not spell it out for you? Again, they try to put it in several parts on the label, but how many people actually take the time to read that label and understand the concern there? And then you could also blame the gardeners, especially these organic gardeners that are wanting to go out and, they're trying to avoid chemicals in their garden. They don't want to use fertilizer. So they want to use free manure to put in their garden for fertilizer. Well, they got what they paid for, unfortunately, in that situation. Free manure sometimes has other issues that can carry over. Now they're no longer an organic gardener or an organic farm situation. The consequences here, you can see the collateral damage in so many different directions. Eventually, this is going to come back to bite you. And one of these days, somebody's going to get sued. I'm just waiting for it to happen. I'm surprised it hasn't happened yet. But we've had many, many encounters. I mean, I can't tell you the number of times this summer, I probably get 2 or 3 gardeners walk in my office every single week, bringing me tomatoes and other plants in their garden. They're twisting up and curling. The first thing I ask them is, have you used any hay or any manure in that garden or grass clippings that you composted from your lawn? Because again, these are all potential ways that these herbicides can carry over. And it's usually one of those 3 things that they haven't even thought about. And again, they have no clue, or maybe they're getting it from that horse stable that bought the hay from somebody else that has no clue. So communication is really the underlying issue here. So tips to avoid damage, as far as drift is concerned, you don't want to spray on hot, windy days. We get more volatility of those herbicides. You want to keep your neighbors happy as far as drift issues. Avoid spraying near trees and shrubs, especially your neighbors' trees and shrubs. If you want to avoid, drift damage or, runoff damage and that sort of thing. Watch the weather, make sure there's no rainfall expected within at least 6 to 8 hours after spraying to avoid runoff of those herbicides. Never, ever, ever exceed the labeled rate or the application frequency. It says no more than 2 applications per year. That's it. That's all you can use that product for. Maybe even rotate your chemicals, go to something else besides a group 4 herbicide. Unfortunately, that's most of what you're going to find in the pasture and forage industry. But there are some other herbicides out there that you might be able to use occasionally without having to rely so heavily on just these phenoxy herbicides. And then make sure you're using the herbicide for the appropriate site. If that manure can stay on the pasture, or if you're going to broadcast that manure back out on the pasture, that's where it belongs. It should stay in that pasture situation. Don't give that manure to your neighbors. Don't give crap to your neighbors. That's really not a good idea. Avoid broadcast spraying during the spring when those trees are going to be taking up those herbicides more readily. Maybe spot spray treatments. If all you got is a couple of thistles out there, spot spray them instead of spraying the whole pasture if that's all you got to deal with. So North Carolina State University has this great publication that talks about herbicide carryover and hay and manure. And in the back of this publication, they have this really interesting little sort of waiver, if you will, that you can, it's a little one-pager. It's like an advisory for your clients. And this is something that, if you're in the hay business, I would consider maybe giving this to my clients when I sell them hay. You can put their, your name on there, the label of the product that you used, the date and all that sort of thing, and give them a warning label when you sell them the hay. And that way they have in writing that, hey, you're not supposed to sell this hay or move manure from horses or whatever after use of this hay. Because again, it could carry over and be a problem in a vegetable garden or whatever situation that we're talking about here. So this is something that you might want to consider using, or maybe even put a sign up. Maybe you just need a sign in your barn that says, hey, we treat with herbicides that could carry over. You need to be aware of this, okay? So it's up to you. And from a liability standpoint, the label says you're responsible for this, okay? Because it clearly states on the label that you should not move that manure or that hay off farm unless it's for an intended use that's safe, okay? So it has to be within that labeled use. And so you are somewhat responsible for this. And I don't know, if you got called into a courtroom, if you said, well, I just didn't give them any information, I didn't communicate with them, it's their fault. They should have asked the question, if we spray with herbicides, or they should just assume that. I don't know if that's going to hold up in a courtroom. I really don't. And I don't know if that's ever been tested, and I hope it never does, because for the sake of our industry, this could be a huge problem and could eventually affect these herbicides that we have available as far as tools in our toolbox. So to kind of wrap up our discussion today, again, just, we talked about, integrated pest management earlier that Roger was talking about. We apply the same principles to weeds. Try to look at other options for weed control. We have a pre-emergent now called Prowl that's really good at preventing a lot of weed problems. If you use that early in the season, you can head off a lot of weeds, and maybe you don't have to spray as often with these other herbicides. Again, they're good herbicides. There's a time and a place to use them. Make sure you identify your weeds and spray selectively. Only apply the herbicide that you need for those particular weeds. Maybe all you need is 2,4-D to clean up that pasture. You don't need the dicamba or the triclopyr or something a little bit stronger that's going to have a longer residual activity. So know your weeds and spray only for what you need. Keep your grass thick and healthy to avoid weed problems in the first place. Don't overgraze it. If a grass or pasture is overgrazed, like Brenda was saying, you get below 3 inches with your fescue, you're going to have more weed issues at the end of the day, because those weeds are going to outcompete that grass. Spot spraying applications rather than broadcast spraying. If you only have a few weeds, that may be all you really need to do. Keep good records of your herbicide applications. That's going to help you. If you ever do get called into a courtroom, that's what those records are for. They're to protect you. And make sure you calibrate your sprayer so you're not spraying too much or too heavy in certain areas and that sort of thing that might cause damage to trees and other plants. For more information on weeds, especially weed identification, again, that's so important to be able to decide what herbicides you need for that particular situation. You can always call the county extension office. Your local county agent can help you with weed identification. You can email us or text us a photograph, and we'll tell you what the weed is. 9 times out of 10, all I need is a picture, or you can drop a sample by. There's no charge for that. But we also have a couple of good references from the University of Georgia on weed identification. These are nice little handy book that you can throw on the dashboard of your truck and keep it with you for weed identification. And again, that's so important in deciding what herbicides are appropriate for your situation. Also, just one more website to throw out there is georgiaforages.com. This is our one-stop shop for everything you ever need to know about, forage management in the state of Georgia. And there's a whole section under the management tab where the yellow arrow is on the screen that talks about weed and insect management. And so you can see more information about all these herbicides that we talked about today, how they respond to different weeds. So if you want to know if this is the best herbicide to control this weed, we have a rating for every herbicide that's out there. So you can click on the weed response chart and see, is it poor, good, excellent weed control for that particular chemical. But again, you got to identify that weed to be able to parse through that information and decide if that's the best control product for you. These summaries are really nice too, because it tells you some cautions on replanting restrictions, if you're going to go back in and plant lagoons, if you're going to overseed your pasture, with any grass and that sort of thing. Some of these herbicides could even affect your reseeding interval in those pasture situations. So you can find a lot of that information on the label, but this is also a nice little, sort of in plain language and on the website that we have here that breaks it down for you. So with that, I've eaten up our time for today. If y'all have any questions, I'll be glad to take a couple of those questions. Otherwise, I'll turn it over to Wade.
Thank you, Paul. I appreciate your comments and your taking on that topic. Mr. Hausch, any questions from you for any of our presenters? Mr. Hausch, you got to click your microphone in that lower left corner and unmute yourself.
That's it. I really appreciate everyone taking their time to give this instructions, and I feel it's been very helpful. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. We're happy to do it. I'm sure I speak for my colleagues. And if you will type your name into the chat box to serve as your sign out and a record of your attendance for the session. I want to thank you and Joe as well for your attendance and attention. I want to thank my colleagues for helping to put this together. I think we'll end up, the first half of this morning is going well. We'll see if I get the last half of this project completed this afternoon. As soon as I do, I will make it available to y'all. We kind of came full circle, starting with pesticide safety, hearing Brenda tell us how our weeds can talk to us. Roger giving us the latest buzz on the Bermudagrass stem maggot. And then what a valuable topic, and I agree with Paul. I've had more vegetable plants especially brought in this year than I can recall in the last previous years with herbicide carryover damage. So, several times Paul and the others iterated towards how important it is to understand that product label. So with that, Mr. House, that will conclude our training. I will get your credit information sent off, and you'll notice your hours credit applied to your license. Usually takes Department of Ag a few weeks to do that, but I will get that recorded and sent off for you. This repeats tonight at 6. My colleagues, as long as this goes right, I won't need y'all again, and that is the goal. But thank you for your time this morning. So with that, I'm going to bid adieu to everyone, unless you want to stay on just a little longer, make sure I get my buttons all punched right. So everybody have a great afternoon.
Thanks
Enjoy
for
your
putting
lunch
this
if that's
together.
where- My pleasure. I hope it comes about and we get a tool we can use. All right. Good to see everyone. I am stopping the.
Email and I'll get it on YouTube as quick as I can this afternoon.
Okay. I'm going to do that right now.
All right.
Thanks,
We'll talk
Paul.
to you later.
Appreciate your help. Good comments in your talk.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yes, sir.
Take care.
See you. Yeah, you too.